The Santa Clara Hospital, located in the southern city of Ceará, Brazil, was a bustling hub of activity. It was no different on that fateful Wednesday night in August 2019. Doctors and hospital staff, accustomed to the usual stream of patients and emergencies, were suddenly drawn to an unusual commotion unfolding outside the emergency room. There were no major accidents or surges in medical cases. Instead, the cause of the disturbance was something much more peculiar. 6 dogs had gathered outside, forming a determined pack that refused to budge. The dogs, a diverse mix of breeds and sizes, sat huddled together, howling softly and whimpering as if they were trying to communicate something important. The staff was puzzled, unsure what to make of the scene. Why would a group of stray dogs station themselves outside the hospital in such an organized manner? While stray dogs occasionally wandered near the hospital, the sight of this many dogs clustered together, refusing to leave, was something they had never encountered before. Several attempts were made to shoo the dogs away. Staff members clapped, whistled, and even tried to lure the dogs away with food, but nothing worked. The dogs stood their ground, unmoved by any efforts to clear them from the entrance. Their unwavering stance piqued the curiosity of the hospital staff, leading them to dig deeper into the mystery. After some inquiries, they learned that the dogs were connected to a recent emergency ambulance arrival. These loyal animals had followed their owner, a homeless man named Luis, who had been brought to the hospital after suffering a stroke. Luis was a well-known figure in the streets of Cianorte, a neighboring city. For over 2 decades, he had lived on the streets after being diagnosed with psychiatric issues, which led him to leave his family and the comforts of a stable home. His brothers had tried numerous times to bring him back, offering him shelter and care, but Luis remained steadfast in his decision to live on the streets, claiming that the streets were his true home. Despite their best efforts, his family could never convince him to return to a conventional life. Luis was not alone in his choice of lifestyle, though. Over the years, he had amassed a family of 6 loyal dogs who had become his constant companions. These strays, much like Luis himself, had no home of their own, and they formed an inseparable bond. Luis cared for his dogs with the little he had, often sharing what little food or money he received with them. The people of Cianorte knew Luis and his dogs well. Their bond was legendary among the locals. Whenever Luis received charity or scraps of food, he always thought of his dogs first, ensuring they were fed before himself. The strays had grown incredibly attached to Luis, never leaving his side. The connection was so strong that the dogs had even followed him to the hospital on that dire night, running alongside the ambulance as it sped through the streets of Cianorte. Upon reaching the hospital, the dogs stationed themselves outside the emergency room, howling and whining as Luis was wheeled inside on a stretcher. Their loyalty to him was undeniable, and the sight of the dogs waiting anxiously at the entrance touched the hearts of those who witnessed it. But while it was a beautiful display of devotion, the hospital staff couldn't allow the dogs to remain there indefinitely. The constant flow of patients, ambulances, and visitors made it impractical for a pack of 6 dogs to block the entrance. However, despite the best efforts of the staff to get rid of the dogs, they simply would not leave. Every attempt failed, and the staff became increasingly frustrated. Eventually, someone suggested calling Amigos de Patas Cianorte, a local animal welfare organization known for its dedication to helping stray animals. The hope was that the volunteers from Amigos de Patas would be able to handle the situation with care and compassion. When the volunteers arrived, they brought blankets, dog food, and treats, prepared to assist in any way they could. These seasoned animal lovers knew how to approach animals in distress and were eager to understand the cause of the dog's persistent behavior. After some further investigation, the volunteers confirmed that the dogs were indeed Luis's faithful companions. They had followed him to the hospital and were determined to stay by his side. The volunteers were familiar with Luis and his dogs. In fact, Amigos de Patas had tried several times in the past to help Luis. On one occasion, the organization had rented a small house with a yard for Louis and his dogs. The house was a modest yet comfortable place, complete with a dog kennel built by one of the volunteers. The volunteers were excited to offer Louis this opportunity for a fresh start, believing that he and his dogs would thrive in their new home. But when they brought Louis to the house, something unexpected happened. He refused to enter. Louis stood at the entrance, looked at the house, and declined the offer with the same words he had told his brothers. The streets were his home. The volunteers were stunned by his refusal. They had worked so hard to secure this place for him, imagining it would offer him the safety and stability he needed. But Louis remained resolute in his decision to continue living on the streets with his dogs. His dogs, as loyal as ever, followed his lead. When they were led to the kennel in the backyard, they quickly escaped, jumping over the walls to be with Louis. The volunteers watched in amazement as the dogs ran back to their owner, proving once again that they would never leave his side. This incident further solidified the bond between Louis and his dogs in the eyes of the community. On the night of his stroke, Louis had been resting in his usual spot when the attack hit. Another homeless person, recognizing the severity of the situation, called for an ambulance. The paramedics arrived quickly and transported Louis to the hospital, but the dogs refused to be left behind. They ran after the ambulance, barking and howling as it sped towards Santa Clara Hospital. When they arrived, the dogs stationed themselves outside the emergency room, refusing to leave without their beloved owner. Inside the hospital, the medical team worked quickly to stabilize Louis. He was in critical condition, and every moment counted. Meanwhile, outside, his 6 dogs remained steadfast, keeping vigil through the night. They paced, whined, and occasionally howled, as if they understood that their human was in danger and needed them close. When the volunteers from Amigos de Patas arrived, they quickly realized that the dogs wouldn't leave until they were reunited with Louis. Instead of trying to move the dogs, the volunteers provided them with food and water, ensuring they were taken care of while they waited for their owner. They also snapped photos of the touching scene, capturing the loyal dogs keeping vigil outside the hospital. Morning arrived, and Louis' condition had stabilized. The doctors informed his family that he would be discharged later in the day. His dog's vigil was about to end, but things didn't go as expected. When Louis was discharged, he left the hospital through a different exit, unaware that his dogs had been waiting for him all night at the front of the building. The dogs, still stationed outside the emergency room, remained hopeful that Louis would soon emerge. The volunteers from Amigos de Patas were heartbroken when they realized that Louis had left without being reunited with his dogs. The dogs continued to wait, their eyes scanning every person who walked through the hospital doors, hoping it would be their owner. Determined to reunite them, one of the volunteers set out to find Louis and bring him back to the hospital. After tracking him down at his brother's house, the volunteer explained the situation. Louis wasn't surprised to hear that his dogs had followed him to the hospital and had kept vigil all night. He knew how devoted they were to him, and he had expected nothing less from his loyal companions. Louis agreed to return to the hospital to reunite with his dogs. When he arrived, the dogs immediately perked up, wagging their tails and barking excitedly as they saw their owner approaching. It was a heartwarming moment, full of joy and relief, as the dogs rushed to greet Louis, licking his face and jumping around him in excitement. The man smiled warmly, patting each of his dogs in turn, clearly happy to be back with his beloved pack. The hospital staff, volunteers, and onlookers watched the reunion with admiration. The sight of the dogs' unrelenting loyalty to Louis and his affection for them moved everyone present. Once the dogs were reunited with Louis, they finally left the hospital grounds, following him as he walked away. Louis's story didn't end there. After being discharged from the hospital, he agreed to return to his brother's house to rest and recover. His family was surprised and overjoyed that he had accepted their help, especially after so many years of rejecting their offers. The health scare seemed to have softened Louis' resolve, and for the first time in years, he was willing to stay with his family, at least temporarily. The news of Louis' temporary stay at his brother's house spread quickly throughout the community. People who had known Louis for years were hopeful that this might be a turning point for him, that he might finally be ready to leave the streets behind. The volunteers from Amigos de Patas were particularly optimistic, believing that Louis's experience in the hospital might have opened his eyes to the possibility of a different life. Meanwhile, the story of Louis and his loyal dogs began to gain attention beyond the local community. One of the volunteers, Simon Zelane, shared the story with the Brazilian newspaper G1, accompanied by photos of the dogs standing vigil outside the hospital. The story highlighted the unique relationship between humans and animals, and it struck a chord with readers everywhere. For many, the tale was a reminder of the power of love and loyalty, even in the most difficult circumstances. Despite the outpouring of support and the hope that Louis would finally leave the streets, things didn't quite turn out the way people had hoped. By the weekend, Louis and his 6 dogs had returned to the streets, resuming their familiar life of homelessness. The reason behind his return remained a mystery, known only to Louis himself. The hospital staff, volunteers, and community members who had hoped for a different outcome were disappointed but not entirely surprised. They had always known that Louis' attachment to the streets was deep, and changing his way of life would not be easy. Still, they took comfort in the fact that, for a brief moment, Louis had accepted help and care from his family, even if it was temporary. As for Louis and his dogs, they continued to wander the streets of Cianord, unaware of the impact their story had made on a global scale. The tale of their loyalty and love had resonated far beyond the streets they called home, leaving an indelible mark on the hearts of all who had heard it. While Louis may have returned to the streets, his story served as a powerful reminder of the unbreakable bond between a man and his dogs.